PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. At the start of the 6th round of the Olympiad, there were just 4 teams with a 100% score. So we have China against Vietnam and Hungary against India. Big matches. Now, I want to take a look at a couple of games from the Hungary-India match. So starting with Sanan Sugirov against Arjun Erigaisi. So Erigaisi on incredible form at the moment, on 100% so far in the Olympiad. So here's the position after 26 moves. Erigaisi has just played the rook here. And there was an exchange. So we're in an endgame. Exchange of pieces and pawns. So we've transposed down into an endgame of rook and bishop against rook and knight. Rook and bishop are well known to be a very strong duo in the endgame. But in this position, well, there aren't many pawns on the board. So, well, let's see what happens. So the knight is attacked. Knight comes back to c4, attacks the pawn, which advances. Now, that could be a little bit uncomfortable for white because that a3 pawn is fixed on a dark square. You can see the same colour as the bishop. Now, that pawn can sometimes be vulnerable as well, but it's nice for black to gain space and fix that pawn on a3. So both sides have to do something about the king. At the moment, black can make no more progress with the rook and bishop. White played pawn to g3, looking to bring the king out round here. I think I would favour g4. We've seen this kind of thing quite recently. You might remember Wesley So squeezing pawns here. And it's an important move, actually. But, well, it's very hard to judge whether it's going to be significant or not, whether you play g3 or g4. Bishop c5. Yeah, I mean, you can see straight away the advantage of a bishop against the knight in this kind of position, because the bishop looks in both directions, ties white to defending this pawn, and there's even a little bit of pressure here. Rook c2 defends the knight, and rook d4. King comes across. The king does need to come out, and black's king comes across as well. I mean, ideally, one would want that king, somewhere over here or somewhere in the middle to put pressure on the knight. But we're a long way from that yet. Rook c3, so that covers this pawn. King e7. And white starts feeling the heat. Knight e5, and it's getting a little bit tricky. Hitting the bishop. And watch out for knight c6. So rook d5 keeps everything under control. Knight comes back to d3. Now, where do you drop the bishop back? To d6? I mean, d6 doesn't look bad. But actually, Erigaisi goes for bishop b6. So why has he done that? Well, it means if this knight moves, let's say knight b4, then the rook can come down to d2 and hit the f2 pawn. And in combination with the bishop, that's quite serious pressure. It also means the bishop covers the e3 square, so there isn't an annoying check here as well. So king f3 and rook b5. Now this is starting to look a little bit unpleasant for white. And rook b3, excellent move. If that's exchanged off, of course, a very strong passed pawn, and if king d2, bishop d4 prevents the king getting to c3. And that bishop does a fantastic job looking in both directions, and then the king can target that pawn. So knight b4 played. Now, if rook takes, then that wouldn't be so clever for black because the knight finds itself in the right position to take that pawn. So after knight b4, king d7. King just steps across very carefully. Rook d3 check. Erigaisi exchanged and brought the king up. Now this is starting to look unpleasant because black's king is striding into the middle of the board. Not so easy for white's king to do that because it's blocked by the knight. But also white has to take care of these pawns. Look, they're all on dark squares, those pawns. Now it's a moot point whether it would have been better to have the pawn on g4. You know, it could be at some point that the king comes in on f4, but it does feel safer to have the pawn on g4. King d2, bishop d4, so that king just can't step up. Gets the pawn off dark square, but king d5. So basically the king has stepped into the middle. It claims the higher ground. And this is really tricky for white now. So this is a classic example of how a bishop is superior to the knight, playing on both sides of the board and controlling the enemy king as well. So that king just can't step up. I mean, I think whatever white does now, it's really difficult. h5 played, just again fixing those pawns. If knight b2 check, then because the king is in such a good position high up the board, it simply steps across. Well, in fact, you can win this pawn if you want to, but you can also head for the kingside pawns. g4, so Sugirov simply gives away a pawn, but actually it's pretty much Zugzwang here. For example, if knight f2, let's just see what happens if white moves the knight. Bishop e7 hits the pawn. This didn't happen, but I just want to give you a typical variation. King d4, so now the king has stepped to the side. The king comes across, it basically body swerves. It's just like in rugby, you send them one way and the king dives the other. And, well, that king is just going to step up and take those pawns. And one of those is going to score a try. Okay, let's go back. So that's why white simply gave up a pawn. That was taken. Well, Sugirov, this is the one last try. He was hoping to exchange pawns, but I mean, there really is nothing here. The knight is now trapped. Again, a classic example of how a bishop can dominate the knight in combination with the king. There's no way out for that knight. King e6, knight comes here, and bishop g5. The knight has gone. One last trick. Knight f5 takes now. Don't take the f pawn because the king steps across and takes here. But instead, Erigaisi played king d5, and that's the end of that. For example, if king c3, bishop e7 hits this one, king c4, you can see the king is just getting squeezed away. And this pawn is irrelevant. And because the bishop is on the same colour as the queening square, it's a win. Now, you know, if you want to go back and pick this one apart, you'll find moments where white could have improved. Nevertheless, this kind of situation with rook and bishop against rook and knight with pawns on both sides of the board is very difficult indeed to defend, particularly when Erigaisi plays so accurately. Now, that was a win for India. I just want to look at one more game from this match. Vidit Gujrathi against Benjamin Gladura from Hungary. Vidit playing white. Now, you might have noticed, yep, we've got a bishop here. And Vidit's pieces are really active, and he's got a beautiful centre supported by the king. I mean, it's quite clear that white has a big advantage in this position. But Vidit hasn't won any material yet. But yeah, big advantage. I mean, particularly you can see these pawns are fixed. And they're on a light square as well. So there's play on both sides of the board. So Gladura played g5. So what you need to do when you have knights is try and get squares for them. So this breaks up these two pawns. So in principle, I think it's a good idea. But Vidit meets this beautifully, actually. So first of all, in exchange, that seems like black has achieved something there in breaking up those two pawns. But this next move from Vidit, a very confident decision. He played rook c8. So he just wants a rook exchange. I mean, it doesn't have to do that, but it works out extremely well. So Gladura exchanges. Bishop attacks the pawn, so the knight comes to d6. Hits the bishop. Also hits this pawn. So it seems like black is okay here. Bishop f5. Now, this is the position that Vidit will have calculated to some depth before playing rook c8. It's a really important moment, because if black can take that bishop, of course he wants to, and somehow neutralise white's advantage, then everything is fine. But Vidit had seen that after this, white still has a huge space advantage. This is a target. The king and the pawn really nicely placed. And this knight is a massive problem. Already, it's going to be possible to trap that knight with h4. Okay, let's see what could happen. So king e7. King f4. f6. Defends the knight. Knight check. So the king has to keep hold of the f-pawn. h4. There we go. Really nasty. That knight is in a very bad situation. Let's go back here. So, okay, what about f6 instead to bring the knight back here? Well, then knight d5 hits the pawn. So once again, king f7, h4 is very unfortunate for the knight. So king g7 still gives the knight square here. Now, it's not possible to win the knight because it can come back to f7. But after b4, that starts the process of fixing those queenside pawns. And look, the king is just consigned to defending that pawn on f6. The knight is way out of play. You know, white would like to put the pawn on a5, and then it won't be too long before that king can just steam down and take those pawns. And white's pawns are so far up the board, it's game over. Let's go back. So Vidit had foreseen that the exchange would actually result in a winning position for him. So Gladura played h6, h4. The knight goes back to e6. Now with the knight in a better position, it might be possible to take. So Vidit just ducks the bishop back. So knight g7 was played here. If king e7, have a look at this. So white can steam forward with e5. This knight is doing a brilliant job of controlling this knight, actually. Knight b5. Bishop f3. Hits this pawn. Told you that one was a problem. Knight d5. And if king e6, okay, first of all, we'll push the knight away to somewhere horrible. And then king e4. Look at white's centralized pieces. And bishop g4 mate is threatened. You can see black is just getting pushed back I mean, White's pieces are so beautifully coordinated. Now that didn't happen. Gladura played knight g7, but White is just gaining ground again. So having brought the king forward, then e5 is on the cards, followed by bishop c8. So f6. b4, excellent move. So starting the process of fixing these pawns. And now, superb move from Vidit. He needs to find a route through for the king. And this is just like in the other game. So he played e5. I mean, it's remarkable the similarity between this and Erigaisi's game. The king has found a way through. So if you think of, the pawns on a4 and a3, well, we've got these pawns here. And, in some variations, Erigaisi was able to break through with the king to take these pawns. Well, in the same way, this king wants to break through to get to these pawns. And this bishop is a fantastic piece. And these knights just don't have sort of solid anchors. They don't have a pawn protecting them. a4, very good move. So these pawns get closer to the 8th rank and fix these pawns. King e7. Knight d5. I mean, black has no space here. And you can see the bishop controls these squares. The knight controls these squares. It's horrible. Bishop e2. Okay, just keeping an eye here. Knight c8. Bishop f3. Having a look at that one. b6. h5. Excellent move. Fix that pawn on h6. So that's a target for knight and king, actually. Knight c7, no need to exchange. Knight e3, and that's coming back here to hit this pawn. Knight g4, knight g8. Bishop e4, knight e8. Well, it's possible just to play bishop h7 here to push that one out of the way and then take here. But bishop g6, also an excellent move. I mean, White can win this in so many different ways, because the king is so high up the board, just like in the previous game. And Vidit exchanges off his beautiful bishop. Now, he could take here, but there'll be a check on c6, so he played instead king d6. So exchanging allows the king to enter into the position. b5, an exchange, and knight takes h6. Well, here, Gladura resigned. I mean, there really is nothing because the king is about to take this pawn. For example, here, king c5. So this pawn is secure. And that one drops, and that's a very, very easy win. That pawn is going to roll through. Well, these two games provide a really strong lesson in the power of the bishop over the knight when pawns are on both sides of the board. It enabled White, in this case, to gain territory, this bishop. And yeah, it helped that this pawn was fixed as well. I mean, beautiful technique from Vidit, and likewise Erigaisi as well. Now, those two victories enabled India to win the match 3-1 against Hungary. An absolutely, convincing victory. The other two games were drawn. And India roll on. In the other match between the top teams, China drew 2-2 with Vietnam. Ding lost against Lei. He's really not in good form, which is very, very sad to see. So that match ended 2-2. So going into round 7, India are in the lead on their own with 100%, 12 points. China have just drawn one game. They have 11. And in round 7, they face each other. India against China. Gukesh will probably play against Ding. Well, if we don't know if one of them will be rested. But that is a huge match. India-China round 7. There is a rest day tomorrow. So the next, let me see, let me check my diary. Yeah, round 7 will take place on Wednesday. By the way, in the women's Olympiad, India also out in the lead on their own. They had a really important victory today against Armenia. So they're out on their own as well. Wow. And they have a massive game in round 7 against Georgia. India looking really good at the moment. By the way, if you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. There's videos coming all the time. And of course, you'll get notification for when they drop. Thanks for watching.